The corridor monitor froze on a single frame, the nursery doorway, half lit, empty. The nanny's panic signal had activated 6 seconds earlier, then vanished. No alarm followed. No protocol note appeared. I stood still, listening past the hum of the lights, noticing a toy carriage tipped on its side where it should have been stored. Training said wait for confirmation. Instinct said something inside the room had already gone wrong. The Royal Guard stood before the nursery door long enough for the corridor lights to cycle once, their soft, mechanical dimming marking a minute he did not officially have. The wood panel was intact, the biometric seal unbroken, yet the silence behind it was wrong in a way training never quite captured. He keyed his wrist unit again, watching the panic signal log confirm what he already knew. Activation, then manual suppression from an internal console, no automatic cascade. That alone placed the incident outside acceptable variance. He requested clearance through the proper channel and received only a buffering delay, the system stalling under a priority override he did not recognize. The air was cooler here, conditioned separately for the child's quarters, carrying the faint antiseptic scent used only in private wings. He removed the seal manually, feeling the resistance give with a muted crack that would be logged, reviewed, questioned later. The door swung inward without resistance. Inside, the nursery lights were on their lowest evening setting, casting shallow pools of amber across the floor. The crib was empty, its sheets neatly folded back as if prepared rather than disturbed. A night monitor hummed softly, still active, its lens angled toward the doorway instead of the bed. He crossed the room without urgency, each step measured, noting the absence of sound that should have accompanied a sleeping child. No breath, no rustle, no instinctive shift at unfamiliar presence. On the far wall, the access panel cover was slightly ajar, the screws replaced but not aligned, a small error that suggested speed rather than care. He knelt, ran 2 fingers along the floor near the threshold, and felt the faint grit of dried soil where polished marble should have been clean. The nanny's personal communicator lay beneath the rocking chair, its screen cracked, battery intact, last outgoing signal time-stamped 2 minutes after the panic alert was cut. He did not touch it. Instead, he opened his internal channel again, reported a forced entry and a missing principal, and received silence in return. When he exited the nursery, sealing it behind him, the corridor felt narrower, the walls closer than before, and he understood that whatever had happened here had not been improvised. Someone had known exactly how long they had before a guard would stop waiting. The first response team arrived under secondary authority, 2 junior guards and a technical officer, their movements careful but restrained by the same unspoken uncertainty that now framed the wing. He briefed them without commentary, assigning positions and restricting access to the immediate corridor, noting how the technical officer hesitated at the open access panel before beginning diagnostics. The preliminary scan returned incomplete, logs overwritten by a higher-tier credential that did not belong to any department scheduled on the wing that night. When he requested the credential registry, the system flagged his query for supervisory review, delaying release. He marked the time mentally. Footsteps approached from the western junction, softer than standard patrol, and the director of domestic security appeared, jacket unbuttoned, expression composed but alert. The director asked for a status update and received facts only: missing child, compromised surveillance, forced entry logged. There was a pause after the last item, long enough to be intentional. The director instructed him to secure the area and await further orders, citing jurisdictional overlap and the need for centralized command. The guard acknowledged without agreement, watching the director's gaze move briefly to the nursery door, then away. As the director departed, a message finally arrived on his wrist unit, not from command, but from facilities, confirming a temporary maintenance override in the east service corridor during the same window as the signal suppression. Maintenance records showed no such work scheduled. He redirected one junior guard to review physical access points, while the technical officer isolated the nursery feed, revealing a clean splice where footage should have been archived. No residual corruption, no error flags, just absence. The palace remained quiet, evening routines proceeding elsewhere, unaware. He imagined the child carried through service corridors designed to be invisible, past doors that opened only for those who knew how to ask. Another directive came through, this time explicit: stand down, pending review. He complied in form, not in substance, continuing to collect timestamps, cross-referencing badge pings, noting which doors had opened without recorded biometric confirmation. Pressure accumulated without sound, a tightening of options rather than an escalation of force. When a senior aide arrived to retrieve the nanny's communicator for administrative handling, he blocked the attempt with a procedural citation, his tone even, his stance immovable. The aide withdrew without argument, which unsettled him more than resistance would have. By the time command finally acknowledged his earlier report, the window for clean recovery had narrowed. He logged one final update, attaching evidence that would be difficult to ignore, and waited, knowing that waiting was already a concession.
The acknowledgement from command arrived stripped of urgency, a neutral receipt stamped with supervisory routing codes that redirected authority upward and outward, away from the wing where time still mattered. The guard remained at his post, posture unchanged, while the palace continued its evening cadence beyond the sealed corridor, dinner service carts moving on schedule, distant doors opening and closing with the soft hydraulics of normalcy. A new presence joined him at the threshold, the deputy marshal, precise in bearing, voice controlled, eyes assessing the scene as if it were already concluded. The deputy asked for a concise reconstruction, and the guard delivered it without inference, noting suppression timestamps, overwritten logs, and the maintenance override that should not have existed. The deputy listened, then issued an instruction framed as caution rather than command, advising that any further action required consolidated approval due to sensitive overlaps. The phrase carried weight without clarity. As they spoke, the technical officer quietly flagged a pattern in badge telemetry, a cluster of dormant credentials briefly activating along a service route that bypassed ceremonial checkpoints. The guard absorbed the information without comment, committing the sequence to memory as the deputy concluded with a formal stand-down directive. Compliance would mean withdrawal, preservation of hierarchy, and a report trail that could be managed. He acknowledged receipt, then asked a procedural question about child welfare escalation thresholds, citing a clause rarely invoked outside drills. The deputy's pause was brief but measurable. The answer came carefully worded, granting latitude under imminent risk while cautioning against unilateral pursuit. It was permission shaped like restraint. As the deputy departed, a sealed message arrived marked Internal Ethics Review, advising preservation of evidence and avoidance of external notification until assessment completion. The guard noted the sender's office and the time gap between creation and delivery. He reassigned the juniors to fixed positions and took the service corridor himself, not in pursuit but in verification, moving through spaces designed to absorb sound, the temperature dropping slightly with each step as public architecture gave way to operational infrastructure. At a junction where cameras should have converged, he found a blind angle created by a temporary scaffold, its placement approved hours earlier by a facilities supervisor now unreachable. The alignment was too precise to be coincidence. He stood there, listening to the low-frequency hum of ventilation, understanding that every layer he uncovered increased the pressure to stop uncovering anything at all. The call came while he was still in the corridor, routed through a secure channel that bypassed standard logging, the voice on the line calm, authoritative, and unfamiliar. The caller referenced the child only indirectly, framing the situation as a stability concern and advising that recovery efforts were being handled through appropriate channels. The guard responded with acknowledgement and asked for a recovery location code. The line went quiet for a fraction of a second before the caller reiterated the instruction to disengage. When the connection ended, no record remained on his unit. He returned to the wing to find the deputy marshal waiting, accompanied by a legal liaison whose presence shifted the tone without changing the words. The liaison explained constraints, the necessity of discretion, the risks of misinterpretation, all delivered evenly, without accusation. The guard listened, then requested confirmation that the child had been physically sighted since the panic signal. Neither official answered directly. He noted the omission and provided an update of his own, detailing the badge activations and scaffold placement, placing the facts on record in their presence. The deputy countered with an order to transfer all materials to Central Review and to vacate the area. The guard complied partially, transmitting copies rather than originals, a distinction allowed but discouraged. As he stepped back, he saw a junior guard hesitate at the nursery seal, hand hovering as if to knock, then withdraw. The guard redirected him with a nod, preserving routine. A final message arrived from Ethics Review, this one unsealed, advising continued involvement could compromise neutrality. He read it once and archived it. The choice was narrowing, not between right and wrong, but between visible obedience and quiet action. He requested reassignment to perimeter verification under the guise of compliance and received approval within seconds. As he moved toward the service exits, he adjusted his route by a single turn, aligning with the earlier badge cluster, and felt the familiar weight of protocol settle differently on his shoulders, less like guidance now, and more like something that could be set down without noise.
The service stairwell carried the colder air of the palace's lower levels, the temperature shift subtle but consistent, and the guard adjusted his pace to match the building's nocturnal rhythm, neither hurried nor hesitant. His reassignment granted him movement without scrutiny, a narrow window he used to trace the earlier badge cluster through infrastructure corridors rarely monitored after evening lockdown. The soundscape changed as he descended, the soft polish of ceremonial spaces giving way to exposed concrete and the low thrum of generators, each step confirming he was moving further from oversight and closer to intent. At a maintenance junction marked for archival storage rotation, he found a door recently cycled despite no scheduled access, its handle still cool, suggesting the climate-controlled interior beyond. He paused, listening, then keyed his unit to passive node, cutting outbound signals while retaining local logging. Inside, the lighting was minimal, motion-activated strips illuminating shelving units and sealed crates, the air carrying the faint scent of dust, disturbed too recently to have settled. He moved along the aisle until he heard it, not a cry but a small involuntary sound, a breath caught and released unevenly. He stopped immediately, lowering himself to reduce profile, scanning for secondary presence. A figure emerged from behind a partition, not fleeing, not advancing, but standing in the open with calculated calm. The figure wore administrative credentials and spoke in measured tones, explaining that the child was safe, that the relocation was temporary, that protocol required discretion. The guard did not respond verbally. He noted the absence of escort, the lack of medical support, the way the figure positioned themselves between him and the sound. He requested visual confirmation. The figure hesitated, then gestured toward a side room. The guard advanced slowly, maintaining line of sight, and saw the child seated on a low cot, eyes open, posture rigid with fatigue rather than fear, a blanket draped with care that suggested planning, not haste. He assessed quickly. No visible injury, breathing steady, hands unclenched. Relief registered only as a loosening at the edge of his focus. The figure reiterated assurances, adding references to authority and necessity. The guard acknowledged the statements and asked for transfer authorization codes. None were produced. The standoff resolved without escalation, not through force but through accumulation. The guard cited custody continuity, emergency doctrine, and the original panic signal, each point delivered evenly, without accusation. The figure's responses grew shorter, less certain, authority thinning where documentation should have been. When the figure attempted to contact a superior, the guard allowed it, standing positioned between them and the child, close enough now to register the child's quiet awareness, the way their gaze tracked movement without comprehension. The call ended without resolution. The guard initiated a recovery protocol under child welfare provisions, activating a localized alert that could not be suppressed without creating a visible audit trail. The figure stepped back, hands visible, the decision made by process rather than concession. Additional guards arrived minutes later, their arrival unremarkable on the surface but decisive in effect. The child was transferred to a secure medical suite, escorted without spectacle, wrapped in routine to minimize distress. The guard filed his report in real time, attaching logs, timestamps, and the location trace, knowing the document would travel faster than he would. When the deputy marshal appeared again, expression unchanged, the conversation was brief, procedural, and final. The guard was relieved of duty pending review, his access reduced to personal quarters and administrative corridors. He complied without comment, watching the child disappear behind controlled doors staffed by neutral personnel. Later, alone in the quiet of his assigned room, he removed his insignia and placed it on the desk, aligning it carefully. Outside, the palace continued, lights dimming wing by wing, routines absorbing disruption. His future within the structure remained undefined, but the immediate outcome was fixed, recorded, and difficult to erase. The line he had crossed did not feel dramatic. It felt precise, like a door closed firmly, but without sound. The review period began without ceremony, marked only by the quiet removal of his name from active rotation boards and the subtle recalibration of access points that no longer recognized his credentials beyond approved corridors. The guard moved through permitted spaces with the same measured pace, aware that observation now flowed in one direction, that every motion would be interpreted through a framework already forming without his input. The palace adjusted around the absence of incident resolution from public view. Staff instructed through carefully worded notices to treat the previous night as a systems anomaly under assessment. In controlled rooms, evidence was catalogued and recatalogued, logs compared against redacted baselines, and the guard's report dissected for tone as much as content. He was summoned twice, each session procedural, questions precise and narrow, focused less on the child's relocation than on his deviation from chain of command timing thresholds. He answered directly, without elaboration, resisting the instinct to justify choices that had already produced their outcome. Between sessions, he waited, the quiet broken only by distant mechanical cycles and the faint resonance of footsteps beyond restricted doors. Updates arrived indirectly. The child remained under observation, condition stable, routine reintroduced incrementally. No mention was made of accountability beyond internal review. He noted which names did not appear in any documentation, which credentials were reclassified, which maintenance approvals were quietly voided without attribution. Pressure persisted not as confrontation but as erosion, a slow narrowing of future pathways. An administrative officer informed him that temporary reassignment outside the palace perimeter was under consideration, framed as a neutral recalibration rather than consequence. He acknowledged receipt, understanding the language for what it was. At night, the palace sounded different from within reduced access zones, ventilation louder, human movement rarer, the building less performative and more utilitarian. He slept lightly, waking at intervals he did not track, aware that his role had shifted from participant to variable. The final meeting occurred in a room designed for closure, its furnishings minimal, its acoustics tuned to dampen emphasis. The panel spoke in sequence, their conclusions aligned, though their expressions were not, citing procedural breaches balanced against outcome containment. No commendation was offered, nor was formal censure applied. Instead, a determination of incompatibility was recorded, concluding that his continued presence within central protective operations posed an unacceptable ambiguity. He was reassigned indefinitely to an external security liaison role, effective immediately, access privileges adjusted accordingly. The decision was delivered without hostility, as if neutrality itself required distance. He accepted the reassignment and stood when dismissed, the meeting ending without summary. As he exited, he passed a corridor junction overlooking the inner gardens, where controlled lighting simulated dusk regardless of hour. Through the glass, he saw the child briefly, escorted by medical staff, movement tentative but unrestrained, a small hand gripping fabric with habitual trust rather than fear. The guard did not stop. Observation was no longer appropriate. His departure from the palace followed standard protocol, inventory checks completed, personal effects reviewed, insignia returned to storage. Outside, the air carried a different weight, less filtered, the soundscape broader, less contained. He paused once at the perimeter gate, not to look back, but to register the absence of resistance as it opened. The episode would be archived under internal reference codes, its narrative smoothed for continuity, its edges softened for institutional memory. His role within it would be footnoted, neither central nor erased. As he moved into his new assignment, the structure he left behind continued unchanged, yet subtly altered by a record that could not be fully closed. The guard did not consider the future in detail. He noted only that when protocol and instinct diverged, the cost was rarely immediate, and the outcome, once fixed, did not require recognition to remain true.